Morning, everyone. I'm recovering from a week and a half of the flu, so if at some point this exhort is inaudible, that will be the reason why. This morning I'd like to speak on a theme that is central to the Christian message, and that theme is change. I'm starting with the premise that Christianity is a religion of change. Indeed, Christianity was established on the principle that change is necessary. Personal change, mental change, and spiritual change. Christianity calls us to recognize that maturity cannot be achieved without growth, and growth cannot occur without change. Christianity also accommodates change on a case-by-case basis because it is a living faith, not a dead one. The problem is that we don't always agree on what needs to change, or when, or why. And those disagreements can fuel division. And those divisions are probably the main reason why the idea of change, why the idea of accommodating change makes us feel uncomfortable. But they're not the only reason, because changing any significant part of our worldview is challenging, and it can even be traumatic. We are reluctant to move from a comfortable position of absolute certainty to a position of qualified uncertainty, or even a position of ignorance. We might be cautious of the implications of change. We want to know what's on the other side of the fence before we jump over it. We can be rightfully doubtful of the motivations for change. We can be wary of mistaking arbitrary changes for legitimate ones. And we can be suspicious that change in one small area might produce an avalanche of changes in more significant areas. These reservations are not unjustified. They may, on a case-by-case basis, be unjustified, but in general, they are not. They are perfectly reasonable. Of course, when we finally decide that change is needed, we now have to justify it to other people. We have to decide how we tell them, what we tell them, and how we can make them understand our point of view. And if they don't understand, or if they understand but simply disagree, how do we work with that? And what are the implications for fellowship? Well, we have many examples of personal change, quite radical change in the New Testament. We have the disciple Peter. We have the thief on the cross. We have the Ethiopian eunuch, and we have the tax collector Zacchaeus. But the most dramatic story of personal change involves the conversion of the Apostle Paul. And I find this story particularly instructive because it seems to me that Paul's perspective on change within a religious community was shaped by the nature and circumstances of his own experience. Come with me to Acts chapter 22, verse 3. Let's see how Paul describes himself there. Paul says, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in Jerusalem, educated with strictness under Gamaliel, according to the law of our ancestors, and was zealous for God, just as all of you are today. I persecuted this way, even to the point of death, tying up both men and women and putting them in prison, as both the high priest and the whole council of elders can testify about me. Now come to Philippians 3, verse 5, and let's see how Paul describes himself there. Paul says, I was circumcised on the 8th day from the people of Israel and the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. I lived according to the law as a Pharisee. In my zeal for God, I persecuted the church. According to the righteousness stipulated in the law, I was blameless. And finally, let's see how Paul describes himself in Galatians 1, verses 13 to 14. Paul says, "For you have heard of my former way of life in Judaism, how I was savagely persecuting the church of God and trying to destroy it. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my nation, and was extremely zealous for the traditions of my ancestors." That's quite a CV. And it's passages like this which have led many people to conclude that Paul was a fundamentalist with a narrow view of the world that was subsequently opened up by his conversion to Christianity. And yet, nothing could be further from the truth. Because Paul was a Hellenized Jew, a Roman citizen, trained as a Pharisee under Gamaliel in the school of Hillel. And there were two prevailing schools at that time, the more conservative school of Shammai and the more liberal school of Hillel. And there was a saying that arose, contrasting the approaches of these two schools. The saying was, Shammai binds, but Hillel loosens. And Shammai's curriculum seemed radical to the followers of Shammai because it included Greek poetry and philosophy. And we know that Paul studied these things because he demonstrates his knowledge of Greek literature in 3 places in the New Testament. In Acts 17, verse 28, he quotes the Greek poets Epimenides and Aratus. In 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33, he quotes the Greek poet Menander. And in Titus 1, verse 12, he quotes Epimenides again. Let's take a quick look at those passages. Acts 17, 28. Here Paul is speaking to Greeks, and he wishes to establish some common ground, a basis on which they can actually meet intellectually. He is not pretending to be one of them, but he does wish to demonstrate familiarity with their worldview. And in verse 28, Paul says, "For in him we live and move about and exist, as even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring." And the first quote there, "for in him we live and move about and exist," is from Epimenides. And the second part there, "for we too are his offspring," is from Aratus. And that would have impressed the Greeks significantly, because it showed that Paul has knowledge of their culture, of their wisdom, and he recognizes common ground between them. But he says it is not sufficient to stop there. He wishes to introduce a new, a better way. New knowledge that will change their worldview, that will make it more complete and bring them into a relationship with the God of Israel. Quite a radical doctrine for pagans. Pagans did not have relationships with their gods. They had transactions. The gods of the pagans were like apps. You dialed them up for specific reasons, for specific purposes. The god of the weather, the goddess of the hearth, the god of war, the god of wisdom, the god of fortune. The Greeks didn't think much of their gods. They didn't think that they were powerful enough or competent enough to rule the entire universe. You had to give them small portfolios so they didn't get too confused. And he certainly didn't have a relationship with them. It was all transactional. So the idea of a God who's almighty, omnipotent, who runs everything, and yet can also have a relationship with you, this is a radical, and to some of them quite a challenging idea, maybe even a disturbing idea. Because the Greeks typically saw themselves at odds with their gods. And many of their legends were about the gods and the humans fighting each other or contesting against each other or trying to get one over on the other. But the Jewish God is not like that. You don't have to fight with the Jewish God. He invites you to embrace him. He invites you to a relationship. This is a very radical belief system for the Greeks. But Paul eases them into it by following common ground. Let's look at 1 Corinthians 15:33. Here Paul says, "Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals." And that's the quote from the Greek poet Menander. And again, Paul is speaking to a Greek audience, the Corinthian ecclesia, people who are familiar with Menander. The point Paul is making is that even the people who don't believe in the God of Israel understand how to behave. So much more so should the children of God. That is why he says, "Sober up as you should and stop sinning, for some have no knowledge of God. I say this to your shame." And finally, Titus 1, verse 12. I'll start in verse 10 for context. "For there are many rebellious people, idle talkers, and deceivers, especially those with Jewish connections, who must be silenced because they mislead whole families by teaching for dishonest gain what ought not to be taught. A certain one of them, in fact, one of their own prophets, said, 'Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons.'" And that is a quote from Epimenides. Paul's use of classical Greek literature reflects an open-mindedness to ideas outside his own language, his own culture, and his own religion. He recognizes that truth is truth no matter where it is found. Or as the 5th century Augustine of Hippo would later put it, all truth is God's truth. Of course, truth is not always easy to accept. And Paul was faced with this reality on the road to Damascus. And his experience there is typically described as a conversion, but I prefer to call it a revelation, because his conversion was really a process, not a single event, as it is, I believe, for most of us. And it's the way Paul responded to this conversion process that deserves consideration. Paul, by his own admission, no less than 3 times, was a zealot. He was prepared to kill for his faith. And when zealots are converted from one religion to another, they often remain zealots. And they start acting as if they've always been a member of the faith that they've only just adopted. But Paul did not do this, and it's important to understand why. Firstly, Paul's reputation as a persecutor of Christians prevented him from immediately integrating himself into the Christian community. Christians didn't trust him, they didn't believe him, they didn't even want to be near him. Secondly, Paul had come to see the error of his zealotry. He had gained a new perspective, which was no less devout, but clearly more nuanced. Thirdly, Paul had been humbled by correction. He had encountered new knowledge that contradicted a lifetime of firmly held beliefs. This was an immensely challenging experience. But he trusted the source of that new knowledge and adjusted his views accordingly. Come with me to Galatians 1 verse 15. This is where Paul describes his response to the revelation on the road to Damascus. He says, "I did not go to ask advice from any human being, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before me. But right away I departed to Arabia and then returned to Damascus. Then, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and get information from him. And I stayed with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother." This is important information. Paul tells the Galatians that he did not receive his teachings as a tradition from the apostles at Jerusalem. He is not their subordinate or their disciple. He is their equal insofar as he too has received a personal commission from Jesus. Paul also says he spent time in Arabia and Damascus. What he did there remains unknown, but to me it seems likely that this was a spiritual retreat during which he familiarized himself with the details and the theological implications of his new faith. And Paul emphasizes that it was a full 3 years later, that he finally met Peter and James, 2 pillars of the church at Jerusalem. This is an account of a sincere and reflective conversion. It provides an example for our own approach to change in the Christian community, where sincerity and reflection are of paramount importance. But changing a religious community is no simple task, as the early Christians discovered. Too often it results in conflict because some parts of the community are changing at a different speed to other parts of the community? Can we accommodate these changes without losing fellowship? Is it possible to have a multi-speed church community? The answer to both of those questions is yes, and we should know this already, because our own church community has been running at different speeds for some time. Our churches disagree on many issues, including the question of which issues constitute essential doctrine, which issues we can agree to disagree on. We disagree on divorce and remarriage. We disagree on forms of worship, on prayer to Jesus, on the role of sisters, on the atonement, and to some extent on the basis of fellowship. We even disagree on whether or not we should call ourselves churches. How did the early church address the issue of a multi-speed community in which there was disagreement over what constitutes essential doctrine? Let's take a look at Acts 15, verses 1 to 2. Now some men came down from Judea and began to teach the brothers, "Unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved." When Paul and Barnabas had a major argument and debate with them, the church appointed Paul and Barnabas and some others from among them to go up to meet with the apostles and elders in Jerusalem about this point of disagreement. And what follows in this chapter is a detailed description of the Jerusalem conference and the recommendation that it issued to the churches. And this recommendation is notable for several reasons. Firstly, it presents a compromise. Secondly, it accommodates Jewish Christians still committed to practices they wrongly believe are essential. Thirdly, it accommodates Gentile Christians without placing undue burdens upon them. Fourthly, it requires both groups to accommodate each other. And finally, it does not instruct any church to withhold fellowship from any other church or any members within that church on the basis of this issue. Notice that the principal advocates for accommodation at the Jerusalem conference were Peter, Barnabas, and Paul. And Peter's testimony is significant because we know he had struggled personally with this issue. And just like Paul on the road to Damascus, it literally took a miracle to change his heart. And the result of the Jerusalem conference was not a foregone conclusion by any means. We are told in verse 7 that there had been much debate by the time Peter finally rose to speak. But there was a willingness to resolve the issue. A willingness to resolve it in a way that favoured inclusion rather than exclusion. And this same approach was used by Paul in his advice to ecclesias facing issues that threatened to tear them apart. This is not to say that Paul himself took a casual approach to doctrine. By no means. He even tells the Galatians that if they hear any other gospel aside from that which he has told them, even if it comes from an angel, they are to reject it. Sometimes you'll hear people saying, well, we're not saved by correct doctrine. And sure, that's strictly speaking, that's true, but it misses the point. The point is that we need a baseline of belief, of common belief, in order to share fellowship. So to say we're not saved by correct doctrine is like saying we're not saved by works. Well, obviously, but that's not the point. And it doesn't mean that doctrine is now arbitrary and we can believe whatever we like. And Paul certainly didn't hold that position himself. Nevertheless, time and again, Paul demonstrated the breadth of his capacity to accommodate others. While he taught against error and urged patient correction, he nevertheless shared fellowship with Christians who still observed parts of the Mosaic law. He shared fellowship with Christians who still believed in demons. He shared fellowship with Christians who abstained from meat. Paul did this because he had a positive faith that easily accommodated those whose faith was less mature, was growing, was slightly divergent from his own. In Paul's mind, no essentials were compromised by accepting a range of views, sincerely held, that fell within the broad tent of fellowship defined by a short list of core doctrines. And I say short quite deliberately because the confessions of faith that we find in the New Testament and in the earliest extra-biblical literature of the church are refreshingly simple. These doctrinal statements are concise and entirely positive. They list only what is believed, not what is denied. They begin with Christ, not with Adam. They do not use technical or outdated language. They do not split hairs or quibble over definitions. They do not introduce unbiblical concepts. And they do not contain amendments. The essentials of our faith can, I believe, be summarized in 6 words: God, sin, humanity, Jesus, community, and destiny. And when we understand what these words represent, there is no need for debate. We are a community. Christ died for all of us, not just a few. And if we aspire to unity with Jesus, we must seek unity with each other. In the words of Paul, there is one body and one Spirit. We are called to the one hope, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all.